What is one teacher you absolutely hated in school and why? Mr. Miller, American History, 9th grade. He was so dry and mean. A student attacked him with a pen. I kind of felt bad for him, though, lol. I once borrowed a textbook to study during lunch, and he asked me twice to give it back at the end of the period, then sent a kid to find me to get it back. Everyone failed the Regents exam. I don't remember anything I learned.
Sounds like Mr. Miller was having a rough time. It's wild how some teachers can make the experience so unmemorable. That pen attack must have been something. The focus on getting that textbook back just shows his strictness. It's funny how everyone bombed the Regents, but no one seemed to care about the material. Just goes to show how a teacher's vibe can really affect the learning.
We've had this history/civic substitute that nearly every single one in our class disliked. From middle school to high school, this lady hadn't changed at all. I don't believe she knows that how she teaches irritates everyone. She'd always expect much more from us than we could ever deliver, except a couple people. It felt like every time she taught us, she got very disappointed with us. In our high school class, I have a friend who was really good at those two subjects she was a substitute for. It was really clear she favored him over anyone else, since he could actually answer most questions and add more to them. Every time we had to send an essay to her or make a presentation, she'd only tell that friend how good he did on the essay or presentation. She ignored everyone else's works, and we never got to see how well we did. It sucked so much that all of my motivation to study those subjects that I was already disinterested in was left to ashes.
It's not uncommon to have that one teacher. I remember feeling the same way about a substitute we had. She just didn't get how to connect with us. The favoritism really stung, especially when my friends and I put in effort but felt invisible next to one guy who seemed to get all the praise. Honestly, it kind of killed our drive. Makes you wonder how some teachers keep their jobs.
My elementary school librarian made me cry because I dog-eared a book. I think this was 6th grade, so I would have been 11. I was an avid reader as a kid, but after that I refused to go to the school library during required times. Got all my books from the public library instead, which was a bonus TBH because at school I hadn't been old enough to request the YA books. As an adult, I have books from back then that are so well-loved that I've had to tape them back together. But not a single one has been dog-eared. I have like 12 bookmarks available at all times. This was a surprisingly formative experience.
That's an interesting story. It's funny how a small moment like that can stick with you. I get being careful with books, though. I remember having a similar experience in school where I felt pressure over something minor. Now, keeping books in good shape feels kind of like a personal rule. Guess it just shows how sometimes negative experiences shape the way we handle things later on.
There was one teacher in my school that every student hated. Her name was Mrs. Samra, and she was evil. Can't remember her first name. She was a geography teacher and deputy head, and she gave out detentions for the smallest things. She had the power of knowing if you did your homework just before the lesson and would give you a detention. She was also terrifying.
Sounds like Mrs. Samra really made an impression. I had a teacher like that once. Always on our backs about assignments, even if we thought we had it covered. Everyone dreaded her classes. It's strange how those types of teachers stick in your mind. You remember the anxiety more than the actual lessons. But they do teach you a lot about responsibility, I guess.
Grade 6 history and geography. One test took 3 days. 1 day to do the test, and 2 days for the teacher to call students up and one by one make fun of them for mistakes they made in front of the whole class. It was like a brutal stand-up routine. Have you ever seen a map? Did you ever see Fredericton in Nova Scotia? Oh no? It's always been in New Brunswick. I've never heard of a volcano making rock formed from granules of ocean sand. I hope you got a good sleep last night because you clearly slept through the class where I explained what the British North America Act is. And so on. Jerk!
That sounds pretty rough. I remember a similar situation in school. Our teacher would call us up too, but instead of making fun, she'd just give us this disappointed look. It hit harder somehow. It's strange how those moments stick with you, especially when a teacher decides to turn learning into a roast session. Makes you question their reasons for teaching in the first place. Just awkward all around.
10th grade math teacher, couldn't teach to save her life. I gave up mid-semester, over half the class failing. I just decided to completely disregard class and ignore her instruction. Sit in the back and play games on my calculator. She called me out in front of the class, demanded I participate. I turned it around on her, told her she obviously sucked at her job. She threatened to call my parents, and when that got her nowhere, sent me to the principal's office. I instead got in my car and drove home. Wasn't having their shit. 11th grade web development teacher, mean lady, had it out for me and a friend of mine for whatever reason. She had her favorites in the class, and we weren't it. My cell phone went off in class. My dad accidentally called me. She tried to confiscate it. I told her it was my property, and she could kiss my ass. She tried to grab it out of my hands, and I shoved it down the front of my pants. She tried to send me to the principal's office as well, got in my car and drove home again. I don't do well with authority that is on a power trip, grinning, squinting face.
Sounds like you had a rough time with teachers who didn't really connect with students. It must have been frustrating when they tried to exert power in those situations. I can see why you choose to just leave instead of dealing with their nonsense. Ignoring authority like that can be tempting, especially when they don't seem to have a clue. It's good you found a way to cope, even if it wasn't the conventional route.
Had a teacher in elementary school that I was convinced had it out for me. One time I was shining a reflective light into someone's face, and after she told me not to do that, the aforementioned someone tripped on nothing, and she used it as an excuse to lay into me. I have more stories about her. She was the worst.
Sounds like that teacher really had it in for you. It's wild how kids can be perceived as troublemakers for just having fun. I can imagine that kind of situation stuck with you for a while. Those kinds of experiences shape how we feel about school, for sure. Seems like you had your fair share of run-ins back then.
Grade 2. I didn't learn to read an analog clock in school previously, and my parents never taught me. She made me stay during lunch every day until I learned to read it, and I went days and days without eating lunch at school. I was too afraid to tell my parents because I didn't trust them either and was afraid they'd tell me I deserve it for not trying hard enough.
That's a rough experience. Sticking around during lunch without eating just to learn something seems excessive. It's tough when you feel like you can't rely on the people who are supposed to help you. Learning should be supportive, not a punishment. It's a reminder that education should be more about understanding and less about pressure.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.